Hey guys, Devon with Sports Headquarters here, and today we're going to be going over some of the different kinds of line, some of the differences between them, and some of the specific applications I like to use with them. So the three different basic kinds of line we're going to be covering and going over today are braid, mono, and fluorocarbon. So starting off with braid, braided line is going to have no stretch to it, which makes it very, very sensitive and really good for lots of finesse spinning applications or any lighter lures you're throwing. It's also got no memory, which is also a really good thing when you're using it on spinning reels. And I also really like using it for top water because it floats and it's not going to impede the action of any of the baits you're throwing. It's also going to help with the hook sets based on the fact that there's no stretch to it. The hooks are basically going to sink in right away as soon as you pull the rod back. There's a few different kinds. You can get 4-strand, 8-strand. 4-strand is good for anything. It's the most basic kind. You can also get like a super slick, which is an 8-strand weave, so it's a little bit smoother. Some guys prefer that for even lighter lures, or for example like hair jigs and stuff like that. So for the most part, I like to use braid on spinning reels and topwater frogs and things like that. So the other two most popular kinds of line that most guys are using are going to be monofilament and fluorocarbon line. Because they're both clear and they're not very easily identifiable compared to braided line, lots of people tend to get them mixed up or confused, and they're actually very, very different. So we'll start with going over mono. Monofilament line has the most stretch and the most memory. Stretch can be good in a lot of ways. For example, if you're using it as a leader, if you use braid as your main line and you're using mono as a leader line, it's going to help with any like shock absorption and stuff like that, and it's going to help keep the treble hooks pinned because of that stretch, as opposed to just straight braid pulling on them, which could torque them out. Mono also floats, so it's also very, very good for topwater leaders because you don't want to be using fluorocarbon as a topwater leader for like poppers and spooks and stuff like that, because it does sink and it will affect the action of the bait. So I really like using mono as a leader line for topwater hard baits, such as poppers and spooks, as I said there. And it's also really, really good because it's the lowest price point out of any line on the market. Mono is also a very, very common main line on spinning reels just because of the lower price point. But between that and braided line as your main line, it's mostly personal preference, but lots of people do tend to lean towards a mono because it's essentially half the price as braid. So lastly, we're going to cover fluorocarbon. So some of the biggest differences between fluorocarbon and mono is that fluorocarbon has a lot less stretch and a lot less memory. The biggest thing for me personally is it also sinks, which really helps reach the maximum depths on lures like jerkbaits and crankbaits and stuff like that. So because of the fact that it's got a lot less memory, it's also a lot more common to see it used on bait casters as a main line, because it's not going to have that kind of like coiling effect that you'll typically see on mono, which can lead to disaster too on bait casters. So I prefer to use fluorocarbon as a main line on a bait caster as opposed to mono. And another aspect of it is the durability. So fluorocarbon is a lot more abrasion and impact resistant compared to monofilament or even braided line, which makes it very, very popular for use as leader line amongst many, many anglers. So now I'm just going to go over some more kind of personal recommendations in terms of size and color and things like that. So if you're going to be using braided line as a main line on your spinning reel, I typically recommend 10-pound test. I like a high vis because it's a lot easier to work with and see when you're tying leader lines and stuff. That's going back to the fluorocarbon, using it as leader line. You can also go with an 8-pound test if you're going to be using a lot lighter lures like hair jigs and stuff like that. And yeah, so typically I recommend 8 or 10 pound for braid on spinning. As for bait casting, if you're going to be using braid as a main line, I typically recommend 30 pound. Anything smaller in diameter than that actually can kind of dig in to the spool where it's laying down the line and result in a backlash on your next cast. So at minimum, I usually recommend 30 pound. And then based off the technique you're doing, if you're going to be doing more top water and flipping and stuff like that, you can go with like a 50 pound, so you're going to be able to pull them out of the weeds. Some guys will even still use a 30 for flipping because the thinner diameter than the 50 pound can also kind of cut through the vegetation a little better. But personally, I like 50 pound for bait casting for top water and flipping, and 10 or 8 pound for spinning. As for fluorocarbon as a main line on a bait caster, I typically like to stick around 10 or 12 as a minimum. I'll lean a little more towards the lighter side if it's a deeper running lure or I'm really trying to get the maximum depth of the lure I'm using. And that's just because the thinner diameter of a 10 versus a 12, 14, 15, and so on, that thinner diameter is going to cut through the water a lot better and help you even more with reaching the maximum depth of that lure. As for any higher pound test fluoro as your main line, like 15, 16, 17, and so on, I typically like to use those for shallower baits or baits that are going to be fished around lots of cover. So if you're using like a really shallow square bill or something like that, I might go with like a 12 pound, maybe even a 14, as opposed to a 10 that I typically use on those deeper runners. And that's just going to be because the line is obviously a lot stronger and you're not going to be too concerned about the diameter of it and getting the maximum depth out of it. And obviously with that higher pound test comes the better strength, which is also why I like to go up if I'm fishing around lots of cover, like for example jigs or chatterbaits and things like that. As for mono as a topwater hardbait leader line, I typically like to actually run a really high pound test, like 16, 18, maybe even 20, depending on the size of the lure and the size of the main line to begin with. But the bigger diameter line paired with the memory that mono has is actually really going to help keep that line nice and straight and not flex a lot, which is going to prevent your treble hooks from getting wrapped in it as it would with a lighter pound test like 6, 8, 10. Those guys like that are going to be a lot more coiled up and just sit on the water and kind of get in the way of your lure a little bit more than a higher pound test would. Alright guys, so that's going to cover the basics for the most common types of line here. We also carry copolymer and lead core, and these are just some of my favorites, but we carry tons of different kinds of braid, a bunch of different brands, same with fluoro, mono. We got a whole bunch here. Check it out on the website, sportsheadquarters.ca. If you have any questions or recommendations, leave them in the comments below. I'll be reading through those, so I'm happy to answer any questions you guys have or try out something you guys might recommend. As for that, we'll catch you in the next video.